Well, my name is Tanya Maria Hughes Sheridan. I immigrated to America. I was 5 months old. So right here, Bicacara is, well, it's not too far from Valletta, but it's considered more central, even though it doesn't look it. When I left Malta, my mother and I we first went to England because my father's English, and we went to England so that my grandparents in England could meet me. And then from there, we took another boat and we came into America by way of New York. And at that time, I didn't realize this because a few years ago we went to Ellis Island, and I thought I'll go in there and I'll look up and see when I came and all that. Well, even when I came in 1949, Ellis Island they weren't processing you through Ellis Island like they used to, like what you see in the movies. So, so I know we came to New York, and then we stayed with my mother. My mother had a cousin that was in New York, so we stayed with them for a few days. And then from New York, then we went to Detroit. And the reason that we were in Detroit, or that my parents even immigrated to Detroit, was because my mother had an uncle that immigrated to America in 1921. And he was in Detroit. And then also at that same time, my mother's two brothers were both living and working in Detroit as well. So they came to Detroit because they had family there. They had thought about immigrating to Australia, but because they had family in America, they came to America instead. And like those two uncles, actually, my folks and my two uncles, they bought a house together in Detroit when they first came here. And my dad and they were all working. My one uncle, he stayed in America for a short time. He was only here for about 2 or 3 years. And then he went back to Malta and lived there. And the other uncle, he stayed, and he ended up working for Ford Motor Company at the Rouge plant. They didn't have any children. The one uncle went back. And before they went back, they all bought a house together. And so in this house was my folks, my two uncles, and then I guess it was a pretty big house because they still had some rooms left over, and they rented the house out to other young men who had come to America from Malta as well. We lived in that kind of a situation in the downtown Detroit area, which is a lot different than it is now. For 2 or 3 years. And then I had a sister that was born a year after we were in America. And then I had another sister that was born 4 years after we came to America. Well, about that time, my dad was getting homesick. So he decided that we'd go back to England and see what was going on then. So in 1953, after my youngest sister was born, we moved back to Malta. So we were there for Christmas of that year. So I was like 4 and a half at that time when we went back to England. So I actually started school in England, and I lived with my grandparents, my father's parents, in England for almost a year, and I started school there. And I ended up going to school, the same school my dad went to, and even had the same teacher he had when he was a kid. And so we were there, I don't know how long exactly, but after we were there a few months, my dad decided, well, no, I don't think so. When they left America, they took an extended, they were able to take like a year. So And I remember a little bit about living in England in that, because, well, one, so I go back to England, I'm 4.5 years old. I'm obviously talking, going to school, and anyway, so I started school. That summer, and then, I said my dad decided to come back. That summer, before we came back to America, my mother and my one sister and myself, we went back to Malta for a few weeks to visit the family. So then we came back to America. When we came back to America that time, part of the journey was by boat, and part of it was by plane. And we're living with my aunt and uncle that was here. My one uncle that stayed, he had married by then, and we lived with them for a while until my folks got their own house. So I started school again. But we lived, as I was growing up, we lived in a Polish neighborhood. And Malta is predominantly Catholic. My dad was Catholic as well. So we moved into a neighborhood that was Polish. We went to the church that was in our neighborhood, and my sisters and I went to that school. So it kind of was, for me growing up, it was kind of an international house. I mean, we lived in a neighborhood that was Polish. My parents' friends were either English, Irish, Scotch, or Maltese. My son was just asking, well, weren't you made fun of or whatever? No, even my mother wasn't as an adult immigrating here, because even today, and even when my mother went to school in Malta, her main lessons were in English, because Malta had been part of the British Commonwealth for over 200 years. So everyone in Malta speaks English, even today. Even today, they might have the signs in Maltese, but they also have them in English. So it's a very different country in how it looks from what we're used to here. Most of the buildings are limestone, similar to what they're like in Sicily and Italy and Greece and that whole Mediterranean area, but everyone speaks English.
So, before you'd left Malta, they were heavily bombed because of World War II.
Yes.
So your parents, had they told you anything about
my
what
father
it
was in World War II. He was on the submarines. He didn't enter the war until towards the end, and then he was in the submarines, and that's how he came to Malta. He was in the Royal Navy. And yes, my mother at that time, she was in her and her siblings were either teenagers or they were in their early 20s during the war. And they would have all the air raids. They'd have to go down into the shelters. They'd often sleep in the shelters so that they wouldn't have to get up during the night. But because of where they lived in Malta, they didn't sustain any direct hit. It was all around in the harbors is where the main bombing was done in Malta. So much so that there's a couple little harbor towns that were made after the war that was from all the rubble. They just pushed it into the sea and built over it. When we went back to England, when I was 4 or 5. And this is a picture of me after I'd been here a few months. Then I have they have their own Maltese cross. This particular church is shown on here because during World War II, like I said, they did most of the bombing around the outside and in the harbors. But one bomb was dropped on this church. And here's another. I have this. They're into jewelry. Gold jewelry is really big in Malta. But So this is a charm, and it shows this church. It's called Malta Church. Well, it was a Sunday morning, and the church was filled with people. Through the top of the dome, a bomb comes down. It was a dud. It never exploded. They still have it there. Well, obviously, I'm here, so I think it's great, and we want to make America great and keep it great.